So now we're in the final video of this series, and that's prepping the surface and applying the finish. For the base, I'm going to apply one coat of a trans tint black dye, and then I'm going to apply several coats, probably 4 to 5 coats of a semi-gloss varnish to the base and the blanket chest. So to begin, last video, before gluing this together, I did sand the surface all the way up to 150 grit, and you typically don't want to go any finer than 150 because it seals the surface and it doesn't allow the stain or the dye to penetrate as deeply. So I stopped at 150. And so now I've just got the black trans tint dye in a secondary container. This is 4 ounces of denatured alcohol to 0.2 ounces of the black dye. And I'm just going to apply it with a cloth. So to begin, I've just got this cotton cloth that I'm just going to fold into a square. And I'm not going to make it real thick because I want to be able to fold it and get it in the corners. So I'm just going to dip it in the trans tint dye and get the cloth nice and wet. And then I'm going to apply it to the surface. I'm just going to start with applying a little bit on the bottom of the feet. And then I'm going to get it in the corner. Now you want to make sure that this stuff doesn't run. So when you wipe it on, keep an eye out for runs. This stuff's really thin anyways, so it's not like a stain where you have to come back and wipe it off or wipe off any excess, because it's so thin it absorbs into the grain pretty much immediately. But you do want to keep an eye out for some runs. Now since we're dyeing the surface, you're going to need to pay attention to all of the hidden areas and make sure that you got dye everywhere. And like I was mentioning, look at all the little hidden areas right around the joinery. Make sure you don't miss anything. So I ended up letting the base set overnight for the dye to dry. And the next day I come back and I fill it and it's a little rough. Even though we used an alcohol-based dye, it still managed to raise the grain just a little bit. So what I've got here is some 320 grit sandpaper. And I'm going to use this to very, very lightly sand the surface to remove the dust nibs. But this is brand new 320 grit sandpaper. If you have used 320, that would be better. So what I'm going to do is take 2 pieces of 320, rub them together to sort of remove some of that grit and to make it a finer grit sandpaper. And so now I would say this is probably closer to probably a 400 to 600 grit sandpaper. If you had a finer sandpaper, you could use that, but this is the finest that I have, so I just rubbed it with the other 320. And so now what I'm going to do is very lightly sand the surface, trying not to burn through any of this dye. But the good news is if you do burn through the dye, you can just apply another coat of the dye and it'll hopefully fix that problem. So now I'm going to take the 320, very lightly sand the surface. And that's perfect. I got a little bit of dust coming off, and that's to be expected because we are removing some of this dye. And you want to be especially careful on these sharp edges like this because any sanding at all will probably remove most of the dye because there's not a whole lot of dye on these corners, especially true on the top and the bottom. So if I were you, I wouldn't touch those because they're probably not going to be that bad. Just stick to the main flat surfaces and lightly sand it. So now we're ready to start sanding the lid and the blanket chest. I'm going to be using my sander, hitting it with 80, 120, 180, and then 220 grit sandpaper because I want a nice smooth finish on this, and since we're not dyeing it or anything, I want to take it to as high of a grit as I have in sanding discs, and that's 220. And then I'm going to take that 220 grit sandpaper and I'm going to ease the edges on the lid and the blanket chest, because especially the lid, because that's what you're going to be grabbing when you're opening the lid itself. I don't have any pulls or any hardware on it, so I want to make sure that the edges are nice and soft to the hand. I'm not going to be using any round over bits or any chamfering bits because I like the appearance of the nice square look of this, so I'm just going to ease that with 220 grit sandpaper. So when it comes to sanding the blanket chest, you don't have a whole lot of options. So what I'm going to be doing is setting this on my workbench, and I'm going to overhang the blanket chest by probably about an inch from the edge of the workbench, so that way my sander, when it comes down to sand the bottom, will clear the workbench. And again, just going through the grits, 80, 120, 80, and then stopping at 220. And just like before, take the 220 and ease the edges. And I'm also going to do it on the outside because they're really sharp. Just a little bit. And again on the bottom. So we are finally ready to apply the finish to this project and see what it's going to look like. This is the most exciting part of the project for me, and I really like it. So I'm going to be applying 4 coats of an Armor Seal by General Finishes. This is their wipe-on poly, and this is a semi-gloss sheen. And off camera, I wiped everything down with a tack cloth to remove the dust, and I just put it in this Ziploc bag to make sure that it doesn't dry out. Now to apply it, I'm just going to be wiping it on with a cotton cloth, and probably, like I was saying, 4 coats should give me the sheen that I like. I have a sample board, and I like the way 4 coats of this stuff looks like. So let me go ahead and get my respirator on, and we'll get to applying it. So the first coat of varnish is going to soak up in the surface almost immediately because it's nice and dry. So for the first couple of minutes, just keep an eye on the surface, and if you see any dry spots, just apply a little bit more varnish. And don't forget to put varnish on the top edges as they don't have any shellac. And when it came time to apply the finish on the top, I had the bottom side facing up, and then I applied the finish, flipped it over, and then applied it to the top. And for easier access, I had the base flipped upside down to get the bottom of the feet and the bottom of the aprons. And then I flipped it over and put it on the rest of the base. So my first coat is already dried, and it's been about 6-7 hours, and that's because the first coat always soaks into the grain so much that it doesn't take as long to dry. So I've just got this same 320 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to just sand the surface, use the tack cloth to wipe off the dust, and then apply the second coat the same exact way that I applied the first coat. Now, if you've noticed that if your sandpaper is gumming up, that means the finish is not dried enough, so just leave it alone, let it dry for a few more hours, and then sand it again and see if it's no longer sticking to your sandpaper. As you can see, mine's not. It's nice and dusty, so mine's dried. And now I'm just going to use that same tack cloth that I had in the Ziploc bag and just wipe the surface and remove the dust. Starting with the second coat, I like to go with the grain when I apply the varnish. And I also like to make sure that my pad is not overcharged and that it's not running down the side of the blanket chest, because starting on the second coat, it's going to go on a whole lot easier because the finish has already sealed the surface on the first coat. So it's a whole lot smoother, and it's not going to absorb as deeply as the first coat. Alright guys, I ended up applying a total of 4 coats of the Armor Seal, and I was getting a lot of dust in my shop, so on the 4th coat I ended up thinning it 50-50 with mineral spirits just so that it would dry faster. So after I sanded everything once again with 320, I applied that thin coat, and it honestly dried to the touch in about 45 minutes to an hour. So that's a nice trick that you can do if you're having a lot of dust issues. Just sand it, tack it off really well, and thin your final coat 50-50 with mineral spirits. And it'll just dry a whole lot faster. So instead of using the 4-0 steel wool and the wax to do the final buffing, I want something with a little more sheen, and I like the semi-gloss look. So I'm going to be using a 2000 grit sandpaper. This is the Abralon from Mirka. It's got the foam back on it, but you could use 2000 grit wet and dry sandpaper as well. You just want something that you can use with some sort of lubricant so it doesn't cut as fast. So 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper would work just as well. And I'm going to be using water and soap combination. This is just some dish soap to act as a lubricant just so it doesn't cut as fast. because again, I like the appearance of the semi-gloss on this mahogany, and that's what I'm going to go for. So I've just got the Mirka. It's just on this sanding block, and I'm just going to dip it in the water, and I'm just going to lightly sand the surface. Again, I'm not going to put a lot of pressure on it because I want to retain that sheen. I just want to get rid of the dust nibs. So just light pressure. If you wanted a semi-gloss or a satin look, you could definitely go back and use the 4-0 steel wool and the paste wax, and it'll give you what you want. Now, after I let this dry, I will be applying some paste wax to this, just because I personally like my projects to be the final thing to be a coat of paste wax. I just like the way that it looks and the way that it feels, so that's just my preferred method. But after you sand this with the 2000 grit, you may want to stop there, and that would be fine. But as you can see, I'm barely putting pressure on it, just enough to keep the sanding block on the surface. And I'm also going to get this top lip because I put varnish on it as well. And very, very lightly get the outside edges, just barely. And so now, that's all that I'm going to do. And I'm just going to take a cotton cloth and wipe it down and see what it feels like. And so after getting all the water off, I'm just going to feel the surface, and it is extremely smooth after hitting it with that 2000 grit. And looking at it at an angle, it's still got a nice sheen to it, a semi-gloss sheen. So I'm just going to do the same exact thing to the rest of the blanket chest, and then the top, and then the bottom, and then we will get to putting it all together. So now that I've let the water dry on the surfaces, I'm going to go ahead and wax it with just a cotton cloth. I'm going to be using this feed and wax. It is a beeswax and orange oil. I would typically use just a regular paste wax, but this will do just fine. I'm currently out of the other stuff. Now when it comes time to putting wax on the base, since I've dyed that black, I'm going to go with a darker wax, because when you put a regular paste wax on there on a dark surface and it dries, if you don't get it all off, you're going to see it in the corners and cracks. It's going to turn white. So I'm using a Bry Wax dark brown paste wax. I'm just going to wipe it on, and just like everything else, let it set for a few minutes and then wipe that off with a cotton cloth. And a little goes a long way with this stuff. So just a little bit on the surface, and just rub it in. And I'm just going to let it set for 10 or 15 minutes on the surface, and then I'll buff it off. All right, it's been 20 minutes. Now I'm going to just go ahead and buff it off with a different clean cotton cloth. And I'm going to get the edges, because I put it on the edges as well. And when I apply this to the base, I'm just going to do it the same exact way. Wipe it on with a cloth, let it set 10-15 minutes, and then buff it off. So there's no need for me to show you that. It's the same exact method. Now I'm going to take my glove off, and I'm going to give it a feel. And wow, it's smooth and perfect. So now let's go ahead and get this all put back together. All right, so the wax is dried, and we're finally ready to install the base. I've got the bottom facing up and the front facing me. So what I'm going to do is make sure that the base is where it needs to be. It's positioned just right. Just make sure that it's flush on all four corners of the legs, and then give it a look and just make sure that everything looks good. And I'm happy with where it's at. So what I'm going to do now is take a Phillips screwdriver, since I've got the screws all the way down to where they're flush with the top of the risers. I'm just going to start them, and what that's going to do is it's going to hopefully put an indentation on the bottom panel so that I can remove this and pre-drill. And they're real faint, but I can see the dots where the screws left an indentation. And I've just got a 1/8 of an inch drill bit with a piece of tape to act as a depth stop, so I don't go beyond the 1/2 inch. And so I'm just going to stick the drill bit in and drill it out. And so now what I've done off camera is I've screwed the screws through probably about 1/8 of an inch. So that way, hopefully they'll fall right back into the holes. Just be careful at this point. Make sure you get everything lined back up where it needs to be so that you don't scratch the surface. And there we go. Back in the holes. And now I'm just gonna screw them into place. Well guys, here it is. I got it done and I got it in the house. I'm probably going to leave it downstairs for a little while just so I can look at it when I get home from work and just appreciate the hard work that went into this. You know, whenever you design your own custom piece of furniture and you haven't built that before, you're always going to second guess yourself, but in the end you're always proud of the work that you produce. And I know when I designed this, I wasn't sure if I was going to like that contrasting base, but after putting it all together, putting the finish on it, and knowing what this mahogany is going to turn into, it just looks fantastic, and I couldn't be happier with it. You know, and another thing that I wanted to mention is whenever you're building a project, you know, this size and this scale, it's always good to hone your skills and to learn a new technique along the way. I know that this is only the second time that I cut breadboard ends, so I've gotten better at that process, and I now have a better understanding of how to do that. And of course, cutting the dovetails, no matter how much practice I did before cutting the dovetails, I still managed to mess up a few spots. But now that I've fixed them with the shims, sanded it, put the finish on it, you can't even tell where they are. So, you know, every project that you do, I at least always try to make myself better and learn a new technique along the way. Just keep pushing the limits of your knowledge and just become a better woodworker. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this process, and I hope to see you guys build one. And if you do, don't forget to share it here on SimpleCove.com. And share it on the guild where everybody else can see your blanket chest if you do build this, and I hope that you do. But you know, I'm probably going to leave it downstairs for a little while, and then, you know, a month or two I'll take it upstairs. But for right now, I want to stare at it and enjoy the hard work and the labor that went into building this blanket chest. So I appreciate you guys watching this series, and let me know what you think in the comments here below, and let me know what kind of projects that you want to see coming up in the guild. But for now, I'm going to let you guys sit back and enjoy some of the pictures of the blanket chest. Thanks, guys.